Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to be with you and to welcome a couple of authors who are just brilliant. And I'm over the moon to have them together with each other and with us today. So we have John Guy and Julia Fox, the authors of this marvelous new book. And you can see how much attention I've been paying, Hunting the Falcon. So welcome. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for being here.
Thank you very Delighted to be here.
Well, we have a lot of, and I'll just point, I even have an Anne Boleyn pillow. So Anne Boleyn is a big story always. So let me
Yeah.
just start by asking, as she is one of the let's say more written about, more talked about, more argued about characters in the Tudor age, what inspired you to take on Anne Boleyn as a project?
Partly, I suppose, because she is so fascinating. I mean,
Mhm.
you're pointing to a little cushion at the back there. One of the things that we have, I should have brought it up actually, is an Anne Boleyn duck.
Oh, yes.
Wonderful. Our granddaughter plays with hers in the bath, and it's glorious. And it's got the French hood.
Mhm.
But somebody who can become so famous that she becomes a cushion, a duck, the
Mhm.
subject of films, the subject of novels, it is bound to fascinate us. And we wanted very much, I hope you'll agree with what I'm saying, darling, but we wanted very much to see if there was anything else that could be found out about her, but also to try to give Henry a bit of a bit of an airing as well. Is he really the big bad wolf? Did he have a reason for doing what he did? What
Mhm.
makes him what he is? What makes her what she is? How does it come about that the woman who is his own darling, his sweetheart, he can barely be an hour out of her company. He writes the letters with a little heart, with A.B., and Henry loves Anne.
Yes.
How can it be that he sends for the Calais headsman to slice off her head? So I think it was that. Would
Yes, I mean, it was all of those things. And for
Mhm.
me too, it was a research challenge.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
That's sort of what I do. I like these
Yeah.
challenges, Mary Queen of Scots, Thomas Becket,
Yes.
Thomas Gresham, Margaret Moore, Thomas More's daughter.
Mhm.
I love to think that it's possible still to go into archives,
Yes.
I mean, in this case, in France as much as in the British Isles, and actually
Right.
find incredible new things that people just didn't know were still lurking there.
Yeah.
And also to
Right.
find things, because actually probably about a third of the new finds in this book are also finds that were actually made in plain sight, of things that were hidden away, but no one recognized what they were. I mean, the classic example of that is when Anne was 7 years in France as a teenager with Queen Claude.
Yes.
At the French court. Of course, the French court isn't like the English court. The king and queen aren't together more or less all of the time. Francis was away, traveling, hunting, doing his thing. Queen Claude, they were often in the Loire Valley, but they were often, all over the place and not where Francis was. And of course, if you want to know where Anne was, you have to know where Claude is. And then I discovered that there was a secretary at the French court called Jean de Barillon who kept a journal, and it was actually printed in the 19th century. But that's what you need to actually work out Anne's movements. So it's things like
Right.
that.
Well, and that's wonderful. So let's look at the French court, because she did spend those formative years there. And when you think about when she learned how to behave, how to interact with people, much of that was in France. And so, can you share with us some of the examples of what you found about her life in France, through those journals, through those French sources that we don't as often hear about when we read about Anne Boleyn?
Obviously, French manners, French courtly behavior, that sort of thing. She could dance, she could sing, she could become a normal courtier, but with that slight edge of something a little bit more a little bit more different. But I think it's more than that. Do you want to talk about the examples?
It's the architecture,
Yeah.
the etiquette, the you know,
Yes.
all the protocol, the organization of the rooms, in particular, of course, courtly love, you know, which is,
Yes.
you know, very, very much a big thing there. I mean, it is across Europe, but it's a particularly big thing in France. I mean, I think though the thing that was most impactful for Anne was to actually see three really incredibly powerful women in action.
Yes.
And those three women were Louise of Savoy,
Mhm.
the king's mother, obviously Queen Claude. Although, I mean, you know, to be fair, I mean, she's pregnant for a lot of the time,
Yeah.
Right.
and that sort of slightly diminishes how much activity she can actually, you know, engage in. But of course, also the king's sister, Marguerite of Angoulême. Now, what's really remarkable about these three women is that Francis allowed his mother in particular, but
Mhm.
also his sister, to exercise, if you like, power on their own account. Louise exercised an independent diplomacy. I mean, not just when Francis was out of the country, say fighting in Italy, as in say 1515 when he won the Battle of Marignano, and then came back to France. I mean, in 1529 she negotiates a big treaty actually with the Habsburgs entirely on her own. And it's called the Ladies' Peace actually because she did it with Margaret of Austria
Mhm.
and on behalf of Charles V. I mean, Louise receives ambassador. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, is an ambassador actually a couple of points to France. Once for more than a year, and he was amazed because Louise gave him free access in and out of her chamber. He didn't even have to ask or make an appointment. And Margaret of Angoulême is exercising the same sort of role. Now, of course, when Anne was with Claude and they were at Argentan in 1517, she was there and saw Francis make Marguerite of Angoulême Duke of Berry in her own right, in a
Yes.
special ceremony.
Mhm.
And Marguerite got the title, she got the lands, she was able to sit on the Conseil Privé, the Privy Council, as of course could Louise. Louise also sat on the Conseil Secret. The grant was so worded that none of the benefits of this title could pass to the husband. It was restricted to the incumbent, to Marguerite, but she could pass it on to her children. Now, when Anne got herself created Marquis of Pembroke by Henry, which was on the 1st of September 1532.
Mhm.
Yeah. The grant is exactly modelled on the grant, the template of the grant for Marguerite as Duke of Berry. Anne has the title in her own right. She has the land. She can sit in the House of Lords. There's no evidence that she ever did, but she could. She can pass it down to her children. And the guest of honor was the French of honor. Was the French ambassador. So there are all these resonances, and then in religion too. I mean, many people listening to us now will know that Anne's religion has been deeply contested by different historians, some who think, she was really a Protestant, as well, if you like, fully reformed, and others who think that, she was still really a Catholic. Well, the solution lies in those teenage years in France, because, while Anne was with Marguerite, actually, when they were going to meet Francis, the women were all going down to the south of France, to Aix-en-Provence, that sort of region, Marseille there, to meet Francis when he came back from Italy. And they had a bit of time. They arrived early and they had time to kill. So they went on some pilgrimages, and one was to the shrine, or the presumed shrine of Mary Magdalene. It was at Saint Maximum La Sainte Baume, and they went to see they went down to the crypt of the basilica to see what remained of the saint, and then Claude went up the narrow path up to the grot in the hill just above, and they were fascinated by this. But Louise said frankly, how is it that Mary Magdalene was such a wonderful saint, that, you know, you could have lived a life of debauchery, you know, lived in sin and, you know, done everything, you know, you possibly, you know, that, you know, was humanity could devise, and somehow the saint could wave the magic wand and you would go straight to heaven. She questioned this, and so she called in her, it's a fascinating story, she called in her chaplain, and this was too heady stuff for him. It was too potentially iconoclastic. So he called in his mentor, Jacques Lefebvre d'Étaples, who was actually the leader of the French Reform Party. And he came and did impromptu seminars for Louise, Claude, and Marguerite. And of course, Anne would be there as Claude's demoiselle, sitting on her cushion. She hears all this stuff, and you know, for the rest of her life, she remembers the rest of her life. What's left of the objects which are of greatest number, which are directly connected to Anne, are her books, and the books she and her brother George collected, and there are going to be some 40 of them, and the only people who were collecting this sort of literature, mainly by this published by this particular printer, of course Simon Dubois, who began in Paris but then moved to Alençon because he was protected by Marguerite of Angoulême from the heresy hunters of the Sorbonne. They collect these books, and they're all on this theme of, if you like, moderate reform. It's not it's not specifically anti-papal. It's not specifically anti-Catholic. It does not reject the mass, but it wants religion to become more in tune with the spirit of the Gospels, and things like good works to be more judged in terms of the charitable benefits, but also the state of mind of the donor. So it's no good being a sort of, if you like, Bill Gates figure and just writing a check, you know, for $1 million. I mean, what does that say about the donor's mindset? No, it's the mindset that you gave in the right spirit. So it's that sort of thing. And you know, this, if you like, it solves. Anne wasn't anti-monastic. Lefebvre was not monastic. Queen Claude was reforming monasteries. She was, you know, investigating nunneries. These are all the sort of things that Anne Boleyn does. So that was just a sort of window that opens the door to, you know, something of her state of mind.
Yeah. Right. And I've heard her described when she comes back to England, she's described as more French than English. And so she brings these sensibilities back with her when she returns to the English court. And it's interesting because it's for political reasons that she returns to the English court, and the French English politics continue to really shape her life. Absolutely. But she was very much been a part of that. She's had a front row seat that no one else has had, I think, to see both courts. And although Henry's sort of always seeing Francis as sort of a frenemy, he's sometimes his friend and sometimes his enemy, he's fascinated by Francis in the French court. And I feel like that really is part of his attraction to Anne because of what she represents.
It's certainly part of her attraction for him as well.
Yes.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? One of the things that we were quite excited by was the fact that you could map out their relationship according to the international situation at the time. So if we are, for example, pro-Habsburg, pro-imperialist, pro-Charles V, then Anne's not going to, at the beginning, not even going to be noticed. Whereas the moment that Henry starts to fall out with Charles V and move towards Francis, he notices Anne, because we could never understand how it was that she comes back in, what is it, 1521, but they don't really get anything going until the end of 1525. And it's not like he hasn't seen her. She's been at the court, she's been in a mask, interestingly playing Perseverance, which is wonderful in view of the way they all persevere in this. You know, he'd had an affair with her sister. It's hardly that she was a little wallflower he never noticed. But when they moved towards France, towards the end of 1525-ish, suddenly everything French is fashionable. And hey-ho, what's the most fashionable of all and the most French? And really, for Henry at that stage, rather stunning, is Anne Boleyn.
And he declares his intentions to Anne at more or less exactly the same time, the first treaty with France is signed that isn't just a straightforward peace treaty. The first treaty that's signed, which is in 1526, is actually the first sort of tentative alliance, which is rather different peace treaty. And of course, the climax comes. You know, we then have Anne and Henry on this. You know, he declares himself. She insists on marriage. Henry agrees. There's the whole business of the love letters and all of that. But of course, then they're on this journey. But in that journey towards Henry perhaps obtaining his annulment from the Pope, which of course leads to the fall of Wolsey when that doesn't happen. But Anne and Henry are in a joint enterprise working together. But on that visit, they're not just working together towards the same end, they're also working independently towards the same goal, so that actually Anne has people who report to her directly. And she sends out Stephen Gardiner and Edward Fox, you know, as Stephen Gardiner and Edward Fox are people that Fox she will use all the time. Gardiner was particularly associated in the early years. He became Henry's secretary with trying to get the annulment. But she sends them out with instructions that she writes. And you know, when Francis Bryan is in Europe, I know, working on this, he's specifically told to write to Anne as well as to Henry. There's a wonderful episode in which he says at the end, "I'm sorry, I can't quite pull this off in the way that you want, but please, Henry, can you tell Anne, because I daren't."
Yes.
I just can't give her, you know, I just can't give her
bad news.
I can't give her this.
No.
This bad news. Yeah, and then of course it all just, you know, carries on from there. And the moment, you know, the day on which Anne is made Marquis of Pembroke is also the very same day upon which, through diplomacy initiated by Anne with the then ambassador, Henry and Francis agree on this treaty of mutual aid, about which I have to say historians were completely ignorant in the Anglophile world, because Henry's copy is lost, and in fact you have to find the copy that Francis prepared for Henry, which is actually still in the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, believe it or not, in Paris. And there's no ambiguity, you know, there's no ambiguity about this. That's a full offensive and defensive alliance, which is ratified on that same day as Anne is created Marquis of Pembroke. It's ratified at Windsor Castle, with the French ambassador naturally still there present to do the ratification and as the guest of honor in these ceremonies. And it's on the strength of that treaty, on the strength of that treaty by which, for the very first time in the whole of history, France agrees to help England and Henry with troops, money, and ships and everything else. Should Henry be attacked, and vice versa, Henry with Francis will provide ships, money, and so on. Should Francis be attacked, and it's on the strength of that that Anne and Henry then go to Calais, for the meeting with Francis I, at which Francis receives Anne and presents gifts to her and Henry as if she is already
a bed.
Including an enormous bed, and Francis dances with Anne. And it's on the strength of that. It's all cause and effect. It's on the strength of that Anne finally agrees to sleep with Henry, even though they're not married, but they get married informally and probably illegally the minute they get back to Kent, the minute they land in Dover. And then the beginning of the next year, they're also secretly, but probably legally married. Bigamously in Henry's case.
Right. But let's...
And of course, Anne is pregnant.
Right. So all of that happens, but let's just pick apart a couple of those things. And I'd like to go to the ceremony where she is made Marquess. And you have mentioned that this was based on or patterned on Marguerite of Angoulême's, you know, sort of ennobling as well. So can you tell us, I've seen the document in the British Library where that falcon is crowned, you know, the first time we see a crowned falcon, and it's so beautiful. Can you tell us about what that represented for Anne? She's not yet queen, but it is such a huge step toward becoming royal. So can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about the ceremony, the French connections within that ceremony?
Well, there's a
And
very
what
easy
they meant?
explanation of why the Falcon is crowned,
Yes.
because the plan, Anne's plan, which was
Mm-hmm.
frustrated partly by the need to get moving with things, because
Yes.
Well, she's getting
things,
older
she's
herself.
getting older and
Right.
things were being left quite late. Is that the original plan was that Henry and Anne would be married with
Yes.
Francis present
Yeah.
in Calais. And I mean, it's also a recognition of the extent to which Henry has committed himself to Anne. But of
Mhm.
course, it's also a recognition of the extent to which it's not just any old crown, it's the
Yes.
imperial crown.
Right.
And of course, the imperial crown for Henry, and then of course for Anne, the imperial crown is, if you like, recast in the knowledge in the context of this research project, organized essentially out of the Boleyn sort of family setup at Durham House, where they investigated, and the future Archbishop Cranmer was very much involved in this, as was Edward Fox and a whole team of scholars, many of them from the University of Cambridge, or who had been at the University of Cambridge, who, if you like, they investigated the whole nature of royal and papal power, and discovered that in the Anglo-Saxon world, at the time of the Norman conquest with William the Conqueror, the king was, if de facto, head of the church, and the Pope was simply the Bishop of Rome. And Henry gets this. Henry loves this.
Yes.
Henry loves this is mental food for Henry. Now he's supreme head of the church. He's directly accountable only to God. He sits directly beneath Christ, and all of those things. As supreme head of the church, he can. The monasteries all belong to him. He can appropriate them. He can sort of reorganize them. He can get the revenues. He can appoint bishops. All of those things. And yes, I know everybody knows that. No, well, officially the royal supremacy doesn't come into statutory effect until 1534, but it's already there in embryo, and that informs all the, I mean, the first appearance of it in public is when Henry makes the English clergy pay this enormous fine for aiding and abetting Wolsey's papal administration.
Yeah.
And that's essentially in 1530, early in 1531, where he demands that the clergy recognize him as basically as the supreme head of the church, and the church reply says, thanks to Bishop Fisher's intervention as far as the law of Christ allows. But for Henry, a very minor
detail,
minor proviso. So no, I mean, Anne, anyone who's read about Anne, a little about Anne Boleyn, knows that the White Falcon was a badge of their family through the Earl of Ormond's line, and so basically, giving it the imperial crown, the scepter, sitting on a woodstock, which is a royal, emblem, with a sort of tree stump with roots down, and then roses growing out of it.
Roses,
the progeny that will come from this relationship. I mean, so mind you, she was a fabulous, I mean, it was a fabulous bit of iconography. It was a fabulous bit of device. Yeah.
Yes. And when you think about, so with that image in mind, and with her at her coronation, her apex being visibly pregnant, and everybody knew that, the coronation was of Anne and the child, something.
Absolutely. The dynasty is secured.
Yes, it's secure, and Henry's promising the world that he did the right thing, and see, obviously I'm about to have a son. So it's interesting. I was really struck by the memory Anne must have had of Claude and her time in France, where although Francis was carrying on with different women, there was never a worry that he would abandon his queen, because she was producing the children he needed.
Absolutely.
Exactly so.
Absolutely. This is it with Anne. She's married up, which is what she is supposed to do as a Boleyn. But boy, how up has she gone?
Right.
She moved into something quite different. Marrying the king is something very, very special, obviously. And the coronation itself is going to stay with her. You know, I'm sure you know that actually she was crowned as a queen regnant.
Right.
She was not crowned as a consort.
Right. With St.
She-
Edward's crown. Yeah.
Absolutely. The St. Edward's crown, and she sat on the same chair that our current king sat on as well. Obviously, he couldn't be crowned with quite the same crown because it was a lot of it was melted down at the time of the English Civil War.
Right.
But for Anne, the whole iconography of the coronation would stay.
Yes.
Would stay with her. But as far as children are concerned,
Right.
Henry actually accepts Elizabeth.
Yes.
Quite composedly. He didn't blame her for the fact that it was a girl. She'd produced a living child at their first attempt.
Healthy too.
Well, next time, and a healthy child. Yes, no sickly child here. As the years pass,
Right.
and there is no son, Anne is going to become increasingly worried and concerned.
Yes.
Queen Claude could quite happily settle for Francis's affairs, and boy, did he have many.
Yes.
I mean, he was, you know, in and out of everybody's bedroom like, you know, day follows night. But for Anne, this insecurity, this sense of vulnerability is there, and we rather feel that when she tends to lash out, and she does lash out. Anne's got a temper.
Yes,
she's quite fiery. It stems probably a lot from this sense of vulnerability, this sense of insecurity.
Yes.
Even with Catherine, I know Catherine was put aside, but Catherine was royal.
Yes. Yes.
She had royal supporters.
Royal supporters. Yes. Yes.
Whereas for Anne, she hasn't.
Right.
And in fact, she hasn't built up a supporting group within the court. She's relying very much on her own family.
Yes.
And in fact, the family firm disintegrates, really.
Well, she has no choice because Catherine's already got people signed up. And I mean, Catherine's sort of got, I mean, she's got her knees well under the table and in many ways plays her cards brilliantly.
She does. And Catherine plays on her popularity. Catherine's very popular and she plays on that. Yes.
Popular. And no matter how much Anne gave to charity, and she gave a lot, how much she tried to do in the field of social reform, it was never enough.
Yeah.
He had usurped Catherine. And for some reason, people just would not forget that.
Right.
She'll never overcome it, no matter how hard she tried, and she tried.
Well, of course, the Boleyn also became associated, you know, with the break with the Pope.
Yes.
And that's another thing that was so difficult for so many people. I mean, the Reformation and particularly the early Reformation was so divisive in Henry. I mean, it took us sort of 100 years culturally for all that to sort of die. I mean, the modern parallel, certainly in the United Kingdom, is Brexit. You know, I mean, should we have left the European Union? Should we have stayed in the European Union? I mean, opinions were absolutely evenly divided. I mean, the majority for the break with Europe, very, very slim. But it was a slight majority. But I mean, you know, I mean, those of the listeners who know anything about this sort of debate know that this is rumbling on, and it will continue to rumble on for the next 50 years.
Right. Very divisive. And Anne is blamed by those who are against her for all kinds of things, including that. Yes.
Yes.
So,
but it is easy. I mean, Anne does divide opinion, and it's only fair for us to say that I mean, there are lots of instances where you know Anne behaves in ways that could be interpreted as actually quite vituperative and aggressive.
Yes.
But we felt, after talking about this, you know, I mean, not least, you know, often in the middle of the night. You know,
we really do wake up in the middle of the night, have tea and digestive biscuits.
We decided that the right way to read this sort of evidence was to recognize it, but to show the extent to which it comes from her vulnerability, particularly when produce the
male heir.
And of course
also because of yes, she had married the king, but I mean, she was the son of a,
She was the daughter.
she was the daughter of not exactly a two-bit courtier, but
No.
certainly a two-bit courtier who'd become a bigger courtier. And the family was I mean, Thomas Boleyn's grandfather, Anne Boleyn's great father, was in trade, you know, which I mean, in the
Right.
English aristocracy was
Yeah.
sort of looked down
I was only
to.
going to say the other thing is that before they were married, and even in the very, very early months of their marriage, they were working as a team. They were
Yes.
working together to a shared goal. But
Yes.
once you've got that goal and you've got the reality of living with Henry, well, then
Yes.
I think other pressures really are going to take their toll.
Yes.
And Henry's mindset absolutely changes a little bit. I mean, incrementally, but
Yeah.
you know, I mean, when he hasn't got her but wants to have her, and you know, she's going to be the trophy wife, and she's invested in his enterprise, and you know, I mean,
Yes.
chic. I mean, she is, you know, she has sex appeal for him
Yes.
in a
Yes.
very big way. And then when he's got her,
Yes.
in those older instincts in him about asserting control, not letting go of things, insecurity, you know, basically
Yes.
vulnerability at the sort of opposition, that sense of insecurity that comes from the, you know, he was shocked by the extent of the opposition to his attack on the church, and he was absolutely stunned by the reaction in Europe to the executions of Thomas More
Fisher. Right.
and John Fisher.
Yeah.
And of course, it's as a result of the execution of Fisher that, you know, that Pope Clement VII, you know, puts his foot down and says that, you know, if Henry doesn't basically step back from this, he'll be excommunicated. And the next Pope, Paul III, who comes in fairly smartly after Clement dies, does actually excommunicate Henry, declares him deprived of his kingdom, and also is a heretic and a schismatic. And of course, that really puts, you know, Henry on the spot. And then the question becomes, that French alliance is even more important and to his security. And if that relationship with France wavers a little bit, well, then, you know, he's basically, you know, potentially finished
alone.
Which of course is exactly as this develops in Europe. You can actually see how Anne's stock is coming up or down. I mean, there's one, isn't there? I think it's in the spring of 1535. You know, when essentially this is in flux, and a French ambassador comes over, and the talk is, you know, can a marriage be arranged and a new treaty, a marriage be arranged between Elizabeth, who's only very tiny, but with Francis's third son. And Anne takes the ambassador under a window, said, we can only have a brief conversation with you, but basically we need to get this done or I'm stuffed.
Right. Yeah. She knew how important it was.
She knew.
She knew I'd be in a worse position than before I ever was married.
Didn't she? She said, you know, there's eyes and ears upon me all the time. I can't talk to you any longer.
Yes. Yes. So her vulnerability, but also I think Henry is feeling vulnerable at times, as you mentioned as well. And that combination, two vulnerable people scrambling to try and hang on to power, is an interesting way to see this couple with the passions that are still there, the desire for a son that is ever more pressing. Because Anne, you know, it took so long for the marriage to happen. She's now in a position where, although she is continuing to get pregnant, in those days, she's at an age where many women are no longer able to continue to get pregnant. I mean, her time is literally running out. If you talk about the biological clock ticking,
she spoke about that, didn't she? At one particular time when, you know, she was trying to G Henry up towards the marriage, and she said, you know, you've had the best years of my life.
Right.
I am getting older. I won't be able to have children forever and ever.
Right.
He is aware of that. I mean, she must have been absolutely desperate, you know, every month within her chamber, praying that she wouldn't menstruate, praying that there would be a pregnancy.
Right.
With all the women watching.
Yes.
Which they would have been. And they weren't all her friends, far from it.
Far from it. Yeah.
She had several groups of women in her chamber. She had a few who were family members, her mother, her sister, her sister disgraced herself by going against everything the Boleyns believed in and married down.
Yes, for
That
love.
I've said, what? Yeah, I mean, gosh, perish the thought. She's also got a few who are friends from
Mhm.
her earlier years, like Bridget Wiltshire. And Elizabeth Brown, who's another, the Countess of Worcester. She's got some gentlewomen. But she's also got career courtiers like
Yes.
Lady Mary Kingston, Lady Jane Colthorpe, who had
Mhm.
been Mary's governess, Princess
Yes.
Mary's governess.
Mhm. Mhm.
She's got people in her chamber who were loyal to Catherine.
Catherine, that's right.
They were there because they made a career at court, or because their husbands were perhaps members of Henry's privy chamber. And
Mhm.
Anne did not have the sort of complete choice that you would expect as
Right.
to who she was surrounded by. She couldn't even choose Elizabeth's nursemaid.
Mm. Mhm.
She chose, and Henry overruled her and had somebody else.
Right.
Powers, even in that sphere, were very
Mhm.
limited. So she
Right.
is all the time aware that eyes and ears are on her, and that a lot of them are hostile.
Right. All right. So let's take that story into 1536
Yeah.
as so many things begin to change. And it sort of kicks off in January with the death of Katherine of Aragon.
Yes.
So, how did that change things?
It changed things because it removed an obstacle
Mhm.
to any sort of relationship being resumed with Charles, if
Right.
that's what
Yeah.
was wanted.
Yes.
Charles, when they moved perhaps towards that area, was actually prepared to allow Anne to remain queen. He would have come to an agreement with Henry if that was the way of things, and it would be largely because of trade, which John will explain perhaps. But he had a price. Anne can stay queen, but the next heir is going to be Catherine's daughter, Mary.
Mary. Mhm. Not Elizabeth. Yeah.
Not Elizabeth. And just as Henry has a dynastic streak, of course he does. All monarchs do. So does Anne.
Yes.
Anne's
Yes.
dynasty is Elizabeth.
Is Elizabeth.
Is
Right.
not going to cast her aside. I'm sure some of your listeners will remember what I think is an absolutely wonderful film, actually, Anne of the Thousand Days.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Remember, which was years ago, and it's often on TV and
Yes.
yeah, on Netflix. And I remember going to see it years before I was married, actually. You know, it was a girls' night out, and we went to, and I remember it.
It's wonderful.
It's a marvelous film. But at the end of it, there is
Mhm.
the scene when Henry visits her in prison.
In fiction.
In fiction, of course.
It is
I mean, it
fictional.
doesn't really
Yeah.
happen naturally. But they have what is actually totally correct, I think, that he says, you know, look, you can take Elizabeth. I don't want to kill you. Go abroad, live in France. You like France. Take Elizabeth. And she won't. In the
Right.
film, she won't,
Mhm.
because it's casting aside her daughter, who she
Mhm.
believes is destined for the throne.
Yes.
And that, I think, is so true of
Yes.
what comes in 36.
Mhm.
So the death of Catherine removes a fairly, you know, hefty thorn
Yes.
in the side of any sort of sort of realignment
Mm.
with the emperor.
With the emperor.
And by then,
Well, it's perfect timing for Henry,
it
because
is.
Henry's already opened up. He's not happy with the sort of terms that Francis wants.
Yeah.
Yes.
To continue his support, which is basically, you know, Francis says, "Well, give me tons of money,
Money.
and I'll go off and find Italy, and and I'll maybe help
Right.
you a little bit on the way." And Henry is very skeptical of this, so he opens up a bidding war between Charles and Francis, who's going to give me the most, you know, in terms of my support. And each of them does rather need Henry just to tip the balance, you know, with their
Right.
with their rival. So this is going on, and then Catherine dies.
Yes.
But of course, that's followed also, accompanied really by
Mhm.
Anne having this
The
miscarriage.
miscarriage. Right.
And of course, this is, you know, this is the second
Allegedly of
miscarriage,
a
sort of stillbirth, and
Yes.
I mean, it seems fairly certain it was a male fetus. And of course, Henry thinks, well, that's it. And I mean, actually, to be fair to Henry, Francis was very happy when Queen Claude had 2 girls. But on the third pregnancy, he got really stroppy and started arranging things. And, you know, I mean, he wasn't quite so happy it had number 3 not been a boy.
But it was.
So you can sort of, which it was. So you can sort of see Henry's concern. After all, it is a dynastic monarchy.
It is, and he's been here before. He's got this wonderful deja vu. This is what it was with Catherine, and it's going to be like this with Anne.
And he's been on the throne almost 30 years. And even though he doesn't like to admit it, he's getting older too.
Yeah,
yes.
He is.
Well, he's fallen off. He has this riding accident. He's fallen off his horse.
Right.
And of course, Anne blames the miscarriage on, you know, her, her affairs and shock and anxieties because of the fall off the horse. But of course, what's taking place, perhaps I think a little bit, the extent of it perhaps unknown to Anne, is that, you know, this bidding war is going on. Henry's involving the Privy Council, which is evenly split, you know, as to whether they should stay with France or go with Charles. Thomas Cromwell, of course, who is ever becoming ever more powerful, is rising, a man of oceanic ambitions who wants to take the place that Wolsey. You know, essentially left off. And Cromwell would probably have had it much earlier, but had Anne not effectively occupied the role that Wolsey had. I mean, in many ways, Anne was the second minister in those years, you know, 1529, certainly till 1524, you know, I mean, certainly up to the coronation. And a little bit after. I mean, I think it's just that, you know, I mean, the historians just don't recognize that could be possible because she was a woman. But I mean, in practice, this is how it was. But Cromwell has these ambitions. But something that, you know, quite by chance I knew, which and the sort of cultural extent and significance of it, because I wrote this book in 2019 on Thomas Gresham, who, you know, very few people have heard of. He was Elizabeth I's banker, but he was important credit broker and cloth merchant, and you know, I mean, the leader of the merchant adventurers
and the Royal Exchange
of London. So I learned a lot on the way about the importance of trade. But of course, the key thing to know is that London, which we now think of as one of the world's great, you know, financial centers, wasn't in the 16th century. The Northern Europe's great financial center in the early 16th century was Antwerp. London was almost like a sort of minor suburb of Antwerp. All the money was in Antwerp, and all the trade, you know, was basically controlled out of Antwerp. Luxury goods came from Antwerp, and so and Cromwell had been. When he came as a very young man, he'd been in Italy, and he'd been actually been a mercenary in the Italian wars, but he'd also worked for the Frescobaldi Bank in Florence. And on the way back, he was the secretary to the merchant adventurers in Antwerp. But of course, Antwerp and the territories around it, the commercial center of Northern Europe, was a possession of Charles V, because it was part of the old Flemish Burgundy. That's basically what we know, Belgium and Holland, and it was part of Charles's dominions. So actually, the merchants, I mean, when Wolsey first began making an alliance with France, the merchants were in uproar. There was a trade war with Charles. Henry had to call it off early because, you know, the merchants were losing too much money. The whole economy of the country depended on an alliance, or at the very least a close friendship, a rapprochement with Charles. And so he's pushing, and I think very few people know, we didn't know until I found it entirely by accident, is that in his house in the Austin Friars in London, Cromwell had a portrait of Charles V. Interestingly, there's an inventory. He didn't have one of He didn't have one of Henry. And also Charles sent him a letter through his ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, thanking him for all his efforts, that's Cromwell's efforts, on the emperor's behalf. So I mean, when, as a reference that everybody knows, but no one quite knew how seriously to take it, when the imperial ambassador Chapuis said to Cromwell, well, is Henry going to marry again, you know, if Anne falls, you know, should that happen? And Cromwell said, well, if he did, I'll make damn sure she ain't French. You know, that was in a way all he needed to say. So that rumbles on. Now, actually, one of the things, you know, I mean, again, all your listeners will know that there's this huge argument between the historians. Was it Cromwell who brought down Anne?
Yes, right.
Henry who decided to get rid of her and and take his affections elsewhere. We have a sort of, in the book, a sort of countdown, to sort of disaster, where it's not quite day by day, but it's all the various moves in this. And there's absolutely no question that Henry was undecided about all of this until the very, very last minute. And what tips the balance? We had a sort of eureka moment. What tips the balance is a letter which Henry had received in May of 1536, and which he had read by May the 29th, the day before the first arrests in the in the fall of Anne.
April.
Of April,
yes,
sorry,
of
April, yes. So by the 29th of April, he had read this letter from a guy called Richard Pate, who probably nobody's ever heard of, but he was the French, he was the English ambassador with Charles. And at that point, he was in Italy following Charles as he marched up from the south of Italy towards Rome, and they were just getting to Rome. Much of it was old news that Henry already knew, but there's this shocking paragraph that Charles was thinking of enforcing the decree of excommunication issued by Paul III, and
which meant invasion.
Which meant invasion against Henry, and that the French envoys in Rome were making no objection.
Okay.
That's the deciding factor.
And at that point, Henry is scared.
Yes.
Something has to give, and Cromwell then, just to sort of push him over the edge, produces this evidence of these so-called sexual misdemeanors in the chamber, and that tips the balance. And then Smeaton is arrested. Interestingly, Smeaton is picked on as the weak link, by Cromwell, taken to his house in Stepney, tortured, and then shoved in the tower and made to confess. All stems from there.
It was fairly easy, in a sense, to get some evidence against Anne, in that because she modelled her chamber on French lines, which meant that the men would be able to come in a way that they couldn't under Catherine, for example. They would drift in and out, and it's courtly love, and it's music and it's dancing, and there's a wonderful sort of vibrancy, a buzz about Anne's apartment. But if you're looking at this from the outside with disapproving eyes, then what is courtly love is very easily interpreted as actual physical relationships. And so it could be thought that Anne was presiding over this court of pleasure, this court where virtue was denied, really. Anne herself did tend to have, it's not a flirtatious manner, but she could be a little over familiar with some of the courtiers. Some of them would speak to her in a way that they wouldn't have spoken to Catherine. And again, that can be misinterpreted. We mentioned Margaret Douglas. I think we probably should.
Well, there is, there was a genuine sex scandal in Anne's privy chamber.
That's right. It doesn't actually surface until 6 weeks after Anne's death. But one of the ladies in her privy chamber was Margaret Douglas, who was the king's niece. And Margaret Douglas had an affair with Lord Thomas Howard. And they apparently, according to confessions that came later, they would be in Anne's chambers, quietly reading a poem or whatever, and they would watch for Lady Elizabeth Boleyn, who was one of the ladies of the chamber. She was actually Anne's aunt. She and Anne never got on. We never, tantalizingly, infuriatingly, we don't know why, never got on. And in fact, Lady Boleyn was one of the 4 ladies in the Tower who looked after Anne at the end. But when she seems to have been a sort of policewoman in the chamber, and when she was out, Margaret and Thomas would actually take the opportunity, would take the opportunity to slip into her chamber for a spot of hanky-panky. This happened quite often. And this surfaced. It didn't surface while Anne was queen, but it surfaced six weeks later. And it transpires that although it only became known about 6 weeks later, the relationship had been going on for about a year.
And that's
And
part of the confessions.
Yes.
If you
Mhm.
follow this up and actually go down to the National Archives at Kew and actually read the original confession, you can actually see this has been going on for a year.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
this,
On Anne's watch.
on Anne's watch. So that although this was, if you like, not known and was not as part of the charges against Anne at the time of her fall, the fact is it's the physical, evidence that absolutely proves that
Henry was right.
That there was Henry had
There
a
was-
point.
Absolutely.
There was.
And she was a depraved
and if you
queen.
also think about it, if you also think about it, I mean, this French style of privy chamber, there is no other English queen who has that sort of protocol in the British
Right.
Isles. The only example within the British Isles is the court of Mary Queen of Scots in Scotland, and that all ended very quickly in a sex
Another
scandal.
sex scandal.
Exactly the
Yeah.
same. There were frequent sex scandals in France, of course, in the
Right.
in this way. When Henrietta Maria became Charles I queen, in the
Yes.
And she's French.
she was
Mhm.
French. There was not that sort of court. It was a
Mm.
pure Katherine of
More
Aragon,
staid.
Katherine of
Mhm.
Aragon state type court. Lots of culture, but no
Mhm.
sex.
Mhm.
And I think this is very, very indicative of the whole. I mean, it's the whole sort of Francophile. Everything about Anne is French.
It's very French.
Yeah.
It was ultimately her undoing.
It was.
And in many,
What's her
and in
beginning
many,
is also her end.
yeah, and in many
Mhm.
ways, when Henry had her executed by a swordsman, specially fetched from Calais, at
Yes.
a very high price. This is often interpreted as an act of mercy, but actually, it was actually really quite nasty. It was,
You could read it that way.
you could read it
Mhm.
that way. It's at the
Mhm.
very least sardonic.
Yeah.
You think you're French, you're going the French way.
I
Right.
could-
Well, and the scandal, even if it's only breaking 6 weeks after becoming known, it does reinforce Henry's desire to continue to paint Anne in these terrible ways and destroy her reputation even after her death, which he was
That's
very
right.
interested in. So we see the full circle of
Absolutely.
the French, of the political, as well as the personal and the passionate,
Yeah.
which is usually
Yeah.
the focus, right?
Yeah.
So as we look through that very dramatic May and the fall and all of that, was Henry, and you mentioned the way all of what she did, how active she was in everything that was happening, and her contacts in France and her driving so much of that. When she's gone, is Henry then able to settle? Does his political, I mean, Cromwell steps in, right? That's when Cromwell really takes over. Does the French continue? I mean, there's problems with France and Francis throughout the rest of his reign.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, what
Yes.
actually emerges from this is that there's a rapprochement with Charles,
Mhm.
but it's not a full alliance, or a major treaty or anything like that. Henry then actually declares, I think it's in November of 1536, he declares neutrality for 6 months.
Mhm.
And then it sort of rumbles on. And then, Henry's sort of playing it sort of very, very carefully. And of course, there's a lot of risk because both Francis and Charles get exhausted by warfare, and there's talk of a truce. And in fact, they do actually make a truce at Nice before falling out again. But of course, by the 1540s, again, things have changed again.
Yes.
And Henry decides to basically ally fully with Charles, and then takes up the cudgels, and then there's war. And he leads for the second time in his life. He leads his army in person into
France. Yes.
But of course, what triggers in the intervening period, of course, under Cromwell's steer, he looks away from these two rivals who've given him so much grief. He's on, if you like, sufficiently amicable terms with both in this sort of period of neutrality. He takes up with the Germans.
Yes.
He's not a Lutheran, and he's very wary of Lutherans because he absolutely, he despises Luther still. He may support the anti-papal side of Luther, but not anything. Henry's a full Catholic where the mass is concerned, whereas Luther had basically watered down the theological reading of and also Henry won't go with justification by faith and all of that stuff. So there's this problem. And that's why, in the end, Cromwell steers him towards marrying Anne of Cleves, because
Yeah.
Cleves is poised to join the League of the German Princes, the Schmalkaldic Protestant princes, or Schmalkaldic Reformed princes. But actually, Cleves is not actually yet, or the Duke of Cleves is not yet actually specifically Lutheran. But there's some talk that he might be. But of course, that goes completely wrong. And Cromwell, Cromwell loses
Cromwell loses, yeah.
And is brought down in a catastrophe that's pretty comparable to the catastrophe, which he arranged for Anne.
Yes.
I mean, in many ways, it's as much rigged actually as Anne's fall. But
Yes.
if you're at the Tudor court and you're playing for the big stakes,
he couldn't have been entirely. I don't think Cromwell could have been entirely surprised. He seems in his letters to believe he can talk his way out of it, but he couldn't really have been completely surprised that he knew it from one side and now he was learning it from the other.
Sort of live by the sword. Well,
yes, yes, literally.
You want to die in your bed.
Yes,
and that's safe not to be too close.
Yes, just move right out to the countryside.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to hold it up one more time. As we finish up here, and I just can't thank you enough for that brilliant conversation. What is one thing you would like people to take away about this relationship? And I love that the marriage that shook Europe, it's not just about what happened in England. It was very much an international situation and repercussions. So what's one thing you'd like people to take away from this discussion and from the book?
I think with Anne, it's that she is not a flibbertigibbet. She is actually quite a serious woman. She had books around, religious books in her chamber, but that perhaps she was slightly playing out of her depth a bit. So I think a sort of sympathy up to a point for Anne, and maybe a sympathy also for Henry. He doesn't get much in the way of sympathy, but I think he honestly believed she was guilty. Maybe that's because he couldn't accept any blame for himself. He never ever accepted blame. I mean, blame was for other people, wasn't it?
That was for other people.
Yeah. Blame, like everything else, was for other people. But you can see that he was actually very, very hurt by all of this. It hurt him very deeply. And he did throughout his life after that always say, I won't trust in a woman in that way. I'll trust myself.
Okay.
What do you think, darling?
Yeah, I think if you're going to marry up in the 16th century in the way that the Boleyns contemplated for Anne and Anne contemplated for herself, that's absolutely fine. But you do have to think about what it's actually going to be like to live with this partner. And what he's really like, and not be blinded, essentially by his protestations of love.
Yeah. Beware what you wish for.
Beware what you wish for. I think the stakes were incredibly high, and you might be able to pull it off. I mean, look, Elizabeth Woodville pulled it off with Edward IV.
Yes.
I mean, but she was fecund. She delivered and I have to say, I mean, I think that if Anne had delivered the son, she would have been untouchable, like Jane Seymour. I know and Jane Seymour died, which made her ever more the perfect wife.
Right.
Because, she produced the son, minded her P's and Q's. Yeah. I mean, had
died before Henry got too bored.
Bound to
couldn't put a foot wrong.
bound to obey and serve. Bound to obey and serve as her motto. Exact opposite of Anne. But then I think again, this is why we wanted to do Henry and Anne together, because it's not just the story of Anne or any individual wife. It's how Henry was changing, throughout life. The younger man, the midlife crisis, the experience with Anne. After that, he won't listen to any woman. He'll only trust himself. None of that sort of shared partnership that he had with Anne. That never comes back. And of course, then he develops into the fully fledged sort of huge, more threatening, sort of, if you like, monstrous figure that's depicted in Holbein's Privy Chamber mural and Holbein's
terrified people.
Terrified people.
Well, thank you so much. That is wonderful. And are you working, the two of you, together on anything else, or individually on
At
anything
the
else?
moment, no. At the
Okay.
moment, I think we're rather hoping we might get a little bit of a holiday or a little bit of
holiday.
rest before we think about anything else.
Well,
Would we work together again? Yes.
Yes,
okay.
definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
And we're not divorced yet.
Everyone told us
so-
not to, but it was a huge
Oh,
amount of
that
fun,
was very
wasn't it?
funny.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was very funny. Yes.
Oh, that is wonderful. Well, yes, because we've read your works individually, but this together, this was really so exciting to know was coming. So, well, thank you so much. And I'm just going to hold this up again. Thank
Oh,
you so much for joining us and for taking us through someone we thought we knew so well, but there are so many more things to learn, which is the great thing about these historic figures. As you say, so fascinating that we know that there's more there. So history is just showing us all kinds of things are possible. So thank you so much.
Thank
oh,
you.
thank you. We
Joining us.
enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Been wonderful. And thank you everyone for listening and watching. And we'll see you again as we keep shaking up history together.